Hey everybody, Trey here. Another dangerous day on tap for the southeast. A high risk has been put in place by the Storm Prediction Center, encompassing parts of northeast Mississippi, northwest Alabama, into parts of southern Tennessee. Just a dangerous combination of ingredients coming together today. There's a 30% hatched area for tornadoes surrounded by a 15% and 10% hatched areas. So the threat for strong, long track tornadoes, potentially even a violent tornado or two, is definitely on the table. Damaging wind threat is there as well, and a large hail threat with discrete supercells that can form. So let's dive in here, take a look closely at some of the ingredients we're going to be seeing today. Looks to be a dangerous day ahead. I'll just say that from the get-go. So this is definitely a high tier event, and we will try to dissect it here in the next few minutes. So early morning satellite imagery showing what appears to be a fairly clear warm sector. If we go to the radar here, we do see some storm activity. Mostly, the strongest storms confined to far northeast Mississippi into the western and northwestern kind of quadrant of Alabama there. Those are going to move off to the northeast, and behind that, we see some clearing back there, back into northern Louisiana. That is going to move into the region, and if we look at our water vapor, actually, which is something we don't look at too often here on these videos, but an interesting sight here to see is some dry air starting to affect and impinge upon the region. That is going to provide sort of a lid on renewed convective development throughout the morning hours. So if you recall our last video from a couple days ago, we were questioning whether or not there would be enough of an EML, or an elevated mixed layer, in place to suppress warm sector storm development and keep the storm mode from being messy. Well, that is a little bit more clear now that we're going to get some sort of a capping layer, an EML layer, to advect into the region. And if we look at our Mesoanalysis here, we'll take a look at mid-level lapse rates. Zoom in here to the southeast sector, and you'll notice just a broad plume here of in excess of 8 degrees Celsius per kilometer moving into the region here. This is I saw something last night from one of the SPC forecasters on Twitter saying that the progged lapse rates were going to be near record for this time of year, and these have materialized here in this sort of plume here in Louisiana, moving to the northeast. So there does appear to be somewhat of an EML advecting into the region. That should hold off convective development, at least a vigorous convective development. There is some shower activity here in the warm sector, but we're going to, I think, see vigorous storm activity hold off here for the morning hours, and presenting an even more dangerous setup when you take a look at the other ingredients in play. So the questions we had a couple days ago as far as storm coverage and mode in the warm sector early on have kind of been answered, and answered in a not so good way for the residents of Mississippi and Alabama. Let's take a look at our surface map here now. See, pretty broad southerly flow, fairly weak southerly flow, but we will get surface low development here somewhere in Texas, and that'll move into southern Arkansas by late morning, early afternoon. As it does so, winds should continue to back here out of the south and southeast and strengthen at the surface, continuing to pump these low 70s dew points you see here along the coast into southern Mississippi. Those will advect northward into the region. So we'll have a broad area of mid to upper 60s into the low 70s dew points here across even southern Tennessee, the southern half of Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi. So a very broad warm sector as the surface low continues to strengthen later on today. All right, let's back out here on our mesoanalysis. Take a look at our upper air maps here, and you see kind of our main weather maker here is this negatively tilted trough, pretty strong jet streak here, centered across central Texas. That is going to move off to the northeast today, and as it does so, it's going to take on an even more negative tilt, and we're going to see some nice defluence here across the warm sector. Those sort of the wind vectors moving apart across the northern half of Mississippi, Alabama, into Tennessee. So that promotes rising motion, as we've talked about previously, and rising motion is good for storms. But this is a pretty classic sort of trough setup for severe weather in the southeast. It's not these just massively large amplitude waves you see. It's these sort of not more subtle, but less sort of deep troughs. Are kind of what get the job done out here in the southeast. Flow out of the southwest aloft across this region. That is what we like to see, and what I've again found is pretty favorable for the higher end sort of discrete supercell tornado events here in the southeast. And then when you couple that with the EML, those are the two ingredients I look for a lot in these southeast events, and we've got check marks for both of them this morning. So if we go down to 850 millibars, we see a very broad, potent low-level jet already in place. We'll zoom in here once again to the southeast sector. That's actually not great. The mesoanalysis not quite working today, at least for this product. So we'll zoom back out. You can still see the broad low-level jet there, in excess of 50 knots down here off the coast, 35, 40 knots here across the entire region. That will continue to strengthen and move to the northeast across the region throughout the morning. You can see there, this is 6 hours ahead, so this will be at 18Z or 1 p.m. Central Time. Broad area, 50, even 60 knots of 850 millibar flow there. That is something we were lacking last week in our high-risk event on Wednesday here in the southeast. We did not have a very stout low-level jet, and the mid-level winds were quite weak. And we don't really have that today. We'll go here at 700 millibars, and you'll notice if this works, looks like, oh, there we go. So you can see 50 plus knots here of 700 millibar flow. We just didn't have that last week. The shortwave was trailing off to the west, so our warm sector, the shear, storms kind of went up a little bit before the wind shear was sort of primed for supercell storms and tornadic, at least long track tornadic storms. So that's why you saw a little bit more long track activity toward the afternoon hours when the shortwave kind of moved into the region, and those photographs started to enlarge and get rid of that weakness in the mid levels. We don't have that today. As far as shortwaves go, we've got a few here to pick out. We see one here across western portions of Tennessee, helping to ignite this shower and storm activity. There does appear to be one back here, possibly in central Mississippi, down into southwest Alabama. Perhaps has something to do with these kind of showers here across eastern Mississippi. And as we go forward throughout the day, kind of subtle sort of little kinks in the height contours here, hard to pick out, but this overall sort of main shortwave here at 700 millibars is going to be impinging into the region come the early afternoon hours. So let's take a look at some soundings now. So these are the 12Z observed soundings hot off the press, and we'll start here at Lake Charles, and this is about as good as it gets for what you want to see in the morning if you're a storm chaser out here, not what you want to see if you're a resident out here. Take a look at this just very steep lapse rate plume here, extending just above 500 millibars down to about almost 850 millibars. A 3 to 6 kilometer lapse rate of 9 degrees Celsius per kilometer. Again, that is likely a near record or record value for this region for this time of year. And so we already have mixed layer CAPE approaching 2,000 joules per kilogram. So we already have, basically, this is what you call a loaded gun sounding, a very classic loaded gun sounding. You've got this sort of elevated mixed layer plume here aloft that will suppress convection in the warm sector. Deep moist boundary layer here, 73 over 70 at the surface here at Lake Charles, extending all the way up to 850 millibars. So deep moisture at the surface, near the surface in the low levels, just below this elevated mixed layer. That's going to be somewhat of a powder keg, so to speak, as the forcing moves into the region. That will erode this capping inversion. And as that happens, we're going to have rapid supercell development this afternoon in the warm sector. This is about as good as it gets for southeast severe weather events and any severe weather events in general if you see this sounding in the morning. this kind of loaded gun. Shreveport, not quite as much instability, but we do see this lapse rate plume here, this EML aloft in place that will again continue to advect into the region. Jackson this morning, Jackson a little bit less sort of pronounced EML, but it is, I would say, it is still there. Kind of that drier air we saw on satellite is evident here in the soundings. And take a look at this wind profile. Already, this is a wind profile that you would expect to see with higher end tornado events. We already have effective storm relative helicity of over 400 meters squared per second squared. So rapid warm advection, this veering of the winds in the lowest levels, indicative of strong warm advection ongoing. And this wind shear profile is very conducive for supercells and tornadoes as we go through the day today. So again, our questions have been answered about coverage in the warm sector through the morning. I think it's going to hold off, and this is starting to get very worrisome for the residents out here in the southeast. All right, so let's take a look at a little bit of model data here. This is going to be the 6Z run. We're doing it a little bit too early for the 12Z runs to come in, but this should suffice. Here's our trough back here. This is the 6Z NAM. You can see as it moves northeast, again, it's not that high amplitude sort of wave you might expect to see with a high-end severe event. It's kind of this more subtle, more subdued, lower amplitude wave here, but nice defluence aloft here across the southeast, especially the northern portions of Mississippi, Alabama, eastern Arkansas, southern Tennessee. Very nice defluence there. And very strong jet streaks. So in the exit region here, we'd expect to see rising motion maximized. And if we go down to 850 millibars here, zoom in to the southeast sector, and you'll notice here's our low-level jet, and all it does is increase throughout the day. This is just crazy. And again, we did not see this last week. But we've got broad area 50 to 60, 65 knots here at 850 millibars. Given the southeasterly surface flow, south-southeasterly surface flow, low-level photographs are going to be very, very large. As we already see on the Jackson sounding here, they're only going to get even more potent as the day goes on, as this low-level jet strengthens across the region. Moisture here. Actually, we'll take a look at the surface map here. So keep an eye on that surface low development, like we said, here in East Texas, western Arkansas. As that moves off to the northeast, surface winds should strengthen and continue to back out of the south-southeast. And as that does so, again, that fire hose is going to continue, and we're going to get that moisture continue to be pumped into the region. Looks like COD is having some trouble here. But let's go ahead and we'll go ahead and look at the NAM here on pivotal weather, and we'll go ahead and go down to the surface here and take a look at our moisture. Again, this is the 6Z NAM, so not quite the 12Z run, but you can see those dew points, higher dew points lurking right offshore southern Louisiana. Those are going to rapidly move northward, create a very, very broad warm sector. And let's take a look at a couple just kind of sample soundings here across the warm sector. This is at 18Z. You can see convection already ongoing here, so let's try to pick one a little bit farther away from the convection out ahead. And this is, again, very favorable for severe storms. Over almost 500 meters squared per second squared of effective helicity here. Very large looping photographs. Ample instability. And with southern extent, there's going to be a little bit more of a capping inversion. This sort of lapse rate plume that we were looking at down there might actually stay a little bit farther south. At least these highest lapse rates might stay a little bit farther south and may suppress convective development, maybe altogether, with southern extent down here into southern Mississippi, southern Alabama. But given the amount of instability in place in the wind profiles, still could be a threat for isolated storms down here. I mean, this not much wrong with this setup at this point. And I mean, this is 18Z, and you're already seeing that kind of environment in place. Large instability. This might be a model quirk here, but very large instability, over 2,000 joules per kilogram, very large looping hodographs would be indicative of a strong tornado threat with supercells that can develop. Given the capping in place, I think discrete storms are a fairly good possibility here in the warm sector. We should get at least semi-discrete storms here, given the degree of capping and the fact that they're just warm sector storms by nature. They're a little bit more discrete along these kind of subtle prefrontal confluence bands, and we do kind of see a little bit of a kink here in the pressure contours, maybe a little bit of a prefrontal trough here across east central Mississippi, at least in this run of the NAM, down into western Alabama. So that may be a focus for convective development early on along this sort of boundary here, and then we'll get storms along the cold front as well back here to the west with time. Let's go to, let's take a look at the HER run. I don't believe the 12Z is quite far enough out yet. Actually, we get a few hours here, so let's go ahead and take a look here at what the 12Z HER depiction is showing, at least out to about 20Z, 21Z. So we see our morning storms here depicted fairly well. Maybe a little bit too much coverage here in this initialization, but not bad overall. Those storms continue to move off to the northeast through the morning, and you can see convective development fairly suppressed here in the warm sector thanks to that elevated mixed layer moving into the region. And then by about 19Z, we start to get these beans, these little supercells to go up in the warm sector, semi-discrete. This is as far out as we can go on this run, but you can see just pockmarked across the region, these little beans, these little supercells in the warm sector. These would all have, given the environment already in place, these would have definitely a strong tornado threat and a large hail threat as well, given the lapse rates aloft and the instability already in place. We got one more hour here to go out, if we can get that. Right, here it is at 21Z. We start to see these storms mature here into northwest Alabama, northeast Mississippi. Definitely some helicity tracks there you can see. So by early afternoon, I think we're going to get storm development. Probably by midday, we'll probably get storm development. And then as those storms encounter this environment that's already in place, they're going to rapidly evolve into supercells and rotate and produce potentially tornadoes, some long tracks, some strong, potentially violent tornadoes. I think an important thing to look at here in forecasting is analogs. Past events that have kind of similar characteristics or kind of in the same region that we can look at and say, okay, do we see similarities with this perhaps past tornado outbreak that we see in this event? So I wanted to, for the sake of time, we'll only look at a couple here, but this is last week's event on St. Patrick's Day. And if we look at our 500 millibar pattern here, this is at 12Z. And we will go ahead and go back to our mesoanalysis here so we can compare. So our 500 millibar map. And so this is basically 12Z on the mesoanalysis, and this is what it looked like at 12Z on the 17th. So we had a more potent sort of closed circulation here at 500 millibars. Maybe a little bit stronger of a jet streak here at 12Z. As we moved on through the day, though, kind of was more neutrally tilted here, whereas our event, as we move on throughout the day, this trough is going to become much more negatively tilted, not quite as closed of a circulation. And this is kind of going to give us not quite a direct hit, so to speak, as far as this trough moving into the region. It's kind of be almost a glancing blow as it moves off to the northeast. That might temper the forcing a bit. We saw storms early on maybe get a little bit messy out here. We expected discrete storms here in Mississippi and Alabama. The storm mode got maybe a little bit messy early on. Given the more glancing blow here, storms may be a little bit more discrete given the more sort of glancing blow here. But again, southwesterly flow aloft, you see with these big Dixie Alley events, more of a sort of westerly component to the flow aloft. This is a little bit more southwesterly here. Kind of very similar here in the warm sectors in both cases. But 850 millibars, if we go down to 850 millibars, much weaker low-level jet in place, 35 knots, weakening with northern extent out here across the warm sector. This was at 12Z. And if we move on to 0Z here, it did strengthen somewhat, although not nearly as potent as what we see with this event here today. Low-level jet much stronger already here at 12Z and only going to strengthen throughout the day. Something we did not see last week, which is kind of what we had questions about last week with the photographs. There was some loopiness, some kinks to the photographs, weakness in the low and mid levels. Just not the case today at all. So big difference between last week and this week is that the shear will be in place from the get-go. We don't have to wait for the wind shear to arrive and become supportive of long-track tornadoes. It's going to be like that as these storms go up. So any discrete storm will have the chance of producing a strong long-track tornado, given the parameter space already in place. And then that was a real quick look at the 17th last week. Let's go, of course, anytime there's a big time parameter space in Dixie Alley, April 27, 2011 is going to come up. So let's take a look at that one. Of course, our super outbreak, and you take a look at this 500 millibar map and you kind of see the similarities. The center of the trough was well off to the north. The jet max down here, I mean, this looks very, very similar to what we're seeing today. And you hate to compare anything to April 27, 2011, because that was sort of the big kahuna of tornado events for the southeast. But take a look at this trough. This is at 0Z. And then take a look at the trough here at 500 millibars. Not a whole lot of difference. So obviously a stronger, more closed circulation up here to the north, but as far as the orientation of the trough axis, the jet streak, very, very similar to what we're seeing, to what we saw on April 27, 2011. Maybe a little bit more westerly flow here, aloft, a little bit more zonal in the 500 millibar flow here, but the orientation, very negatively tilted trough, not quite as sort of high amplitude down here in the southeast as we saw maybe with the St. Patrick's Day event last week and some of our more classic failure modes here, but and what we're seeing today, but still fairly similar pattern here. Low-level jet also, we saw 12Z, it was already in place on the 27th and only continued to strengthen throughout the day, 60 knots here across Alabama. And that's what we see today here out of the south-southwest. 850 here, 850s here out of the south-southwest, 50 to 60 knots. So definitely some similarities here, at least in the large-scale pattern for between April 27, 2011 and today's event. Not saying that today's event will be April 27, 2011, but the overall synoptic pattern is somewhat similar, at least, to what we saw that day. So it's going to be a very, very potent day ahead. This is actually the new outlook here from the SPC. And they've still got pretty much the same outlook in place. High risk, 30% hatch tornado area, pretty much the same area, northeast Mississippi, northwest Alabama, southern Tennessee. So going to be a long day ahead for folks here in Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, and the southeast here. If you live in these regions, keep weather radio handy. Stay tuned to your local National Weather Service office, your local news media, meteorologists. They'll give you the most up-to-date information. But the parameter space is definitely supportive of strong to potentially violent tornadoes today. So stay weather aware. Chasers, stay safe out there today. It's going to be a very difficult chase day, but with the potential for fast-moving storms with strong long-track tornadoes. So stay on your toes. Keep your head on a swivel today. That's all I've got for this morning. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next video.